Nice pass. Sensational stuff, that. I don't think Herb knows anything but cook.
Ally. Wood has lost it. McEachin can go all the way. He will.
McEachin pushing it up the floor again, lays it up for two more. And the Snake has started out with a vengeance.
I was born in a small town, Hamlet, North Carolina, which is, from what I heard last year, it's going backwards in population. But yeah, it wasn't much there. It was sort of like a Uncle fan, Thomas Sawyer, existing for my brothers and myself. We lived on a decent-sized property across the road down the hill from a big lake. And we had a great life, you know, a lot of fishing and swimming. I used to play a lot of ball by myself. My two brothers weren't into sports at all, but I used to make my imaginary leagues, no matter what it was, baseball, football, or basketball, and I had players' names, and I did the commentaries. People would drive past, used to think I was crazy, this kid talking to himself and doing flips and all that type of stuff. So I started, you know, getting involved with sports to myself very early. And my father, you know, he put up a basket for us, and they would play occasionally, but primarily I was the main one. I'd be out there playing in the rain or in the snow, you know, in Carolina. And in particular, during that part of my career, when I was just starting to branch out in basketball, I met a guy named Willie Anderson. He took my best friend and I, Ken Neal, up in his wings and taught us everything. I wasn't initially looking at going to Oregon Tech. I was looking at Marquette primarily, but Willie graduated from Oregon Tech, and Willie became like our big brother. So he always wanted us to go to Oregon Tech to try to break his records, and that's the primary reason why we ended up going to Oregon Tech. And I was fortunate to survive and escape my neighborhood without a nickname, and I thought, yes, I've survived with just my name. Anyway, it was my second year in college, and Coach said, I'm going to give you a nickname. I said, I don't want a nickname, Coach. I don't have one. He said, no, I'm going to give you a nickname. We got to give you a nickname that epitomizes the way you play. And he went on for about 4 or 5 other nicknames. Then he came to Snake because I was slim and I sort of moved and slithered through people. And I snapped on Snake because this guy I used to idolize from the University of San Francisco was a guy named Snake Jones. And he actually got drafted by the Boston Celtics, and when I was little, I used to always love watching the University of San Francisco play, and the Snake Jones in particular. So when he came up with the Snake, I said, I'll take that. And that's where it started.
I actually saw Herb McEachin play long before anybody did in Australia, because I played a game against him in 1974. I was on tour with the Newcastle team at the time, and we had about a 20-game tour of the US. We're being flogged by everybody, including Herb's team, in a place called Klamath Falls in Oregon. I remember this other silky smooth guy who just had the most smooth moves, and that was Herb McEachin. In fact, I remember them when I saw him again a couple of years later in Australia.
Willie, he had always told me that I'd always get a shot in Australia through his connections, regardless of what happened, if I wanted to do that. So that was a backup. I did receive invitations to camps from the Houston Rockets and the Chicago Bulls, but I chose the option to come to Australia.
One of the interesting things about Herb McEachin is he came here before the National League started. He didn't come to play in the National League, as a lot of people think. He actually came out to play for the Ryde Eastwood Club in the New South Wales State League. And really, he was a pioneer, because it was very unusual for a young black American to come to Australia in those days and play.
Jerry was already here down in Canberra, and Jerry Lee, and they asked him to put the word in to try to get me to come down to Canberra. And he says, Jerry, as he is, he had a lot to do with getting me here, because I wanted to stay in Sydney. I love Sydney. So it probably would have been Bankstown Bruins or Sydney Supersonics that I would have played with, maybe Newcastle. But Jerry said, look, I was asked to talk you into coming down to play with the Canberra Cannons. They're going to have a team in the National Basketball League starting up in February, March, whatever it was. And that's what they asked me to do. I've done it. Now that's it. The rest is up to you. And that was as simple as it was. And his honesty and directness was what that convinced me to come down to Canberra.
They're all talking about who is this Herb McEachin, because he was awesome when he hit the floor in Australia, and dunking and weaving through defenses and scoring quite a few points whenever he needed to.
We played the first game, and it was against Herb. It was hot, and I lined up opposite him. I'm sweating, thinking I'm gonna pass out, after the trip and all. I said, gee, they got an Aborigine on their team. And he lined up even with me, because at that point you exchange gifts and a handshake with the opponents. And he asked me where I was from. I said, New York. And he said, I'm San Francisco. I'm like, dang. I said, have you seen any bison? Nah, man.
With the Cannons, we had to be rostered to pick up the visiting teams, because the visiting teams didn't have the money to pay for cabs or hire a bus or whatever. So we were rostered, and it didn't matter if you hated this team or you hated the players on the team. If you were rostered to pick some players up that day of that game, you had to do it. And in those days, in the freezing cold in the winter in Canberra, fog or whatever, you had to go pick them up. And in those days, all flights, most teams took the 6 o'clock flight to Canberra. So it wasn't nice, but we did it, and made more friends from the different teams that way. And I thought it was good.
Towards the end of the year, we got on a roll, and we actually, I think, beat the Nuttawading Spectres by a percentage points in getting into the final, and that was just enough to get us into that Cinderella-type NBL Grand Final in '79.
McEachin. He looks very sweet when the shot goes in. He's very, very smooth ball player.
One of my teammates came up to me and said, "Oh, it's great that Jerry Lee, Cal Stamp, and you are here, and instead of now losing by 60, we probably only lose by 30." And I go, "What? Lose by 30?" And up to that stage, I had never suffered a loss by 30 points in my career. And I'm thinking, I thought he was joking at first, and nope, but he was for real.
Herb was just an exceptional player. A lot of Americans that came out were just interested in the scoring side of the game, but Herb was, and always has been, one of the best defenders ever to play the game. I had the unfortunate experience of being guarded by Herb a couple of times, and you know, he wouldn't let you get the ball, and if finally he did get the ball, then it was virtually impossible to score, and he was virtually unstoppable once he got the ball on his right hand. He had the snake move to the basket. He was very athletic, and he had a great mid-range jump shot, so he was very hard to stop.
Well, certainly Herb had been our linchpin all year long. Cal Stamp was also certainly a main dominant player, and we had a couple of local players that were in the starting lineup, Ian Ellis and James Cotta, that James was the scorer and Ian was our ball handler. So most all players had to play their role, and in that grand final, certainly Herb, produced what he normally does, as did Cal, and he worked very hard to get, well into the double figures and almost pull it off, but unfortunately that last second shot sort of threw it the way we didn't want it to go.
St. Kilda was the great team of the NBL in Australia basketball at the time. Larry Sinstock, Danny Musu, Robbie Kadee, all those guys, and we took them to the last 2 seconds of the game, and they made a last-second shot with Tom running out, and I think I nipped a pimple on that ball. If I would have had a little bit more finger on that ball, I could have maybe put that layoff off, but they won it, and it was disappointing. But like I've told a lot of people, in hindsight, it would have been great to win the NBL's first ever grand final. But in hindsight, I don't think I would have appreciated it as much as I did when we eventually did win a grand final down the road.
Playing against the Snake was always the supreme challenge because of his length. He was very agile at 6'4", 5". He also was quick, smart. Whenever I got hot, here comes the Snake. And it was like he can give me the distance so he can put a hand in my face on the shot because he was so long. But then if I go by him, then I was always worried about where he's coming from in terms of behind me.
In Canberra, he's a hero and everybody knows him. Outside of Canberra, basketball was still in those early days, so it's hard for people to realize how good he was. But he's a guy, if you needed points, he can get them. If you need 30 tonight, coach, I'll get you 30. If you need 10, a couple more boards, play some D, I can do that. And he's the guy that you never, all of a sudden you'd look at the score sheet after the game, you say, God, Herb, you got 25. It looked like you got 10 out there because he just did it so easy. Nothing flamboyant. When he dunked, you kind of went, geez, Herb's ready to play tonight because he didn't have to do it all that often. But just a winner at both ends of the court, and that's why he fit in so well with the Cannons structure.
Suddenly the popularity of basketball really took off, and Canberra had some terrific players. Herb McEachin, I still think now could play in the league. He was just such a tremendous player, but the whole, I guess, nature of that team was that a lot of guys had been there, and I can remember we came back from our first road trip and we'd won both games, and the team was just beside themselves because the year before that they didn't win one on the road. So, little things made the team gel together really early, and once again the city got behind it, and Bob did an excellent job of selling it to the team and to the city that we can give Canberra some soul, and so the players took that on board and really wanted to do a good job.
That first year with Phil and Jerry Lee and Herb McEachin and Dave Nelson, Wade Kirkmeyer as a starting five, we just had an awesome group, and backed up by people off the bench. we sold out games towards the end, and the rest really is we just took over the city.
And we were fortunate enough to make it through to the grand final against West Adelaide, who had Al Green, Leroy Loggins, Andy Campbell, and Ray Woods and all those type of guys. So they had a great team, and we knew we had to play well to beat those guys. '83 was a great year, and we won our first title for the Canberra Cannons.
McEachin should score. He does.
People who visited Canberra in the early 80s would describe it as a city without a soul. In fact, that was the term that was used so often. I remember when the Cannons won the championship in 1983, Bob Turner said, "Finally, we've given this city a soul." And that was a pretty apt description of what happened to Canberra when they came back to be greeted by over 1,000 fans packing a pretty tiny airport in those days. Had to be seen to be believed, and in fact it happened again years later with teams like the Canberra Raiders and the ACT Brumbies, but not with the same kind of pizzazz that it did in 1983.
Back then, St Kilda had done it the first 2 years of the NBL, and we all looked up to St Kilda as the team, the benchmark for championship teams in the NBL and in Australian basketball. And to be put in that position again, and the special thing about that grand final against Brisbane in '84 was that we was playing in the Glass House, which was another big stadium. It was actually bigger than the Palace. They could seat 7,000 or so people in there. So I remember our general manager at the time, Ron Harvey, saying, "Gentlemen, this is the first professional grand final of the NBL." And so it was kind of special for that reason. And we were fortunate to win it because Brisbane jumped out to a 22-2 lead on us. They were just shooting the lights out from the three. Ryan Ratliff, Leroy, and those guys. And it was good. It was fun. And to win back-to-back, which was the motivation for us to win. And of course, obviously, Brisbane was trying to win too as well. But we wanted it badly, so we can say, hey, put us in that category with St Kilda, which we did.
There it is. The Cannons have done it again. For the second year in a row, the Canberra Cannons have won the National Basketball League final.
When you talk about the influence that Herb McEachin had on those back-to-back championships, you have to mention Phil Smythe in the same breath, because to me, they were like Rodgers and Hammerstein. They were like Gilbert and Sullivan. They were the ultimate pairing. Phil Smythe, who made all the great passes, and Herb McEachin, who could be there in the right position to catch them and take the right shot. They were just the perfect pair to win a championship.
Herb's the type of player that just produces game in and game out. Consistency is certainly the name of the game, and high percentage. I mean, most people don't know that he shot over 50% for his entire career. And that's something that most players can't claim, especially smaller players. Usually the big power players inside the keyway do that. But Herb, along the baseline, he was tricky, and we certainly depended on him to get our 20 points per game virtually every time we stepped on the floor. In addition to that, Herb's probably one of the underrated defensive players, and you could always match him up either on a small guard, because he was quick enough and long and lanky to cover them, or he could cover much bigger people. And that was an advantage that most coaches love to have.
Everything was kind of going along fine in '85 when we were right there to win it again. His father passed away, and he had to go home and miss the playoffs, and we lost the game to Brisbane in that semifinal. So how important is he? Very important.
At the off-guard position, number 15, Herb the Snake McEachin.
I think the other thing about Herb and the nickname Snake is the fact that he was effortless. And when you watch a snake move, it doesn't seem like it's moving any parts of its body, but yet it slithers along. And Herb was the same way. He could just do things magical without really seeming to try.
Herb was like a guy that would do it all, rebound, pass, score, play defense, and Herb was a winner. So he's a good player, man. I rate him very highly.
Herb was very deceptive, man. I mean, because, the funny thing, he looked like a string bean, man. Hey, Herb, don't get mad at me, man. He like a string bean, but the thing about Herb, man, is that he was so efficient. He was one of the most efficient players, very deceptive. If you seen him walk on the floor, you probably saying, psh, they're making a big deal of this cat. I'm about to crush him. You know what I'm saying? And then out there on the floor, he's very efficient.
I credit Jerry Lee for almost making me retire. I can remember there was this particular training, and Jerry used to run us so hard. He used to say things like, okay, I'll let you guys warm yourself up before training, and as long as you do it right, because if I have to take it over, you're going to regret it. And I can remember in particular this one time we were all doing our little skips and jogging backwards and zigzagging. And I thought we were going at a pretty nice pace, and Jerry snapped. He ran us in the ground for about half an hour, and then we started training. But this one particular training, we were already in training, and I thought I was having a heart attack. My chest was pounding. It was tight. I couldn't breathe. And I remember Jerry said, "Okay, water break." And I didn't make it to the water before we had to get back on the court. And I was seriously trying to put my hand up, go, "Jerry, I quit." But I couldn't say it.
Jerry Lee is probably one of the most underrated coaches that this country has ever seen. He brought to his coaching style a bit of a fear factor, really. Because he played the game so hard, he expected everybody else to play just as hard as him. He actually demanded that on the floor. And you ask anybody that ever played for Jerry Lee, they weren't game to play badly.
We were struggling in the middle of 1988, and with just a barely winning record. And the team decided to have a team meeting, and certainly we felt we hadn't really achieved what we needed to. So we chatted about a few things that were maybe obstacles slowing us down. And over the next 7 or 8 games, I don't believe we lost a game, or if we did, we lost 1 out of the last 8 or 9 in the season. And it was mainly because players accepted their roles and responsibilities a bit better than we had prior to that, because we were a very experienced team. We had a lot of older players and a couple of younger fellows that like to run and use their fitness and youth, but a lot of guys have been around the game a long time. And once we decided what everybody was supposed to do, we did it very, very well.
Everyone on the team was prepared to sacrifice a little bit of their game for everybody else. I think that's what made the team so great. And defensively, the team was really solid. You know, everyone sort of prided themselves on being able to contain their man, or if someone got beat, help out. And no one in the team looked for personal accolades. And perhaps, you know, the guy who I think has probably been one of the greatest, well, has been the greatest player Canberra had, Herb McEachin, probably typified that through the whole group, in that, you know, he would just go about his business, no fuss, and he was just the kind of player that everybody fed off. Once again, he was a player that made other people look good.
We knew that North Melbourne in the final was going to be a tough opposition because they had the Twin Towers, and I think they were all the Boulders in those days. And Tim Dillon was an excellent player. A lot of people wouldn't know him or remember him because he was on the league for a short while. But Scott Fisher was the other one, and certainly people would be familiar with Scott and his antics and his talents. But they also had some backcourt guards, were excellent players, Mark Leader and a few others. So we had to prepare well for that team, and once we knew we were facing them, we knew it would be a slog.
You know, we was at home. It was actually the first grand final ever played in Canberra. So we had a capacity crowd, you know, 6 deep up top standing room, and it was a great atmosphere. The whole town was into it. You know, players were on radio, TV. It was electrifying, so I think that maybe that might have given us the motivation and helped us because they became the 6th man for us with their noise and chanting and all that type of stuff.
Of course, the next game was one I learned from. We actually got thumped, and it was mainly because their physical nature, plus they were, I guess, a little embarrassed about getting beat as much as they did in the first game, and they came out and beat us just as bad in the second game.
We felt that we let that slip by. We wanted to sweep, obviously, in North Melbourne. But yeah, we did notice that, and we did talk about that. And amongst ourselves, the players without the coaching style, we felt like, oh, look, that's the best they got. And you hear teams say that all the time, that, you know, they didn't win, we lost sort of scenario, and we felt that they didn't have a deep bench.
Certainly all year long, we depended on our depth and our experience, to be honest. Even though people thought we were a little older, I thought we just had people who had been around the game and knew what to do in certain circumstances and situations. And going into a game 3, who better to be playing than a bunch of veteran players? And I was a little bit conscious of the fact that the Giants had used their main players quite substantially, especially to come back in game 2 to make sure that it did go to game 3. And we were hoping, since there's a short turnaround, it was a Sunday game, that we'd maybe have enough strength and legs to outlast the guys that had to play 40 minutes for the Giants.
As soon as it's touched, it'll be it. That's it, Willie! And there's the hooter. Canberra win the championship. 108 to 101. Canberra win their 3rd title.
I think 1988 we saw the height of Herb McEachin's powers. I think if you ask Herb to look back on his career, he'll say, okay, he was a good player in the early 80s, but by 1988 he was an absolutely superb player. I think he reached the pinnacle, perhaps tapered off a little bit after that. But in 1988, absolutely at the height of his game, and he could do anything. He was a magician with the basketball in '88.
Offensively, he was tough because You wanted to give him the outside shot because he had a strange-looking jumper. But, boy, if you gave it to him, he'd knock it down. So then you had to get up close to him. And if you ever let him get to the baseline, it was all over with. You know, they call him, you know, he was the baseline bandit. He'd go down and blow your eyes out down there. By all measurements of the top players, he was one of the best.
I asked Herb to come off the bench the first year in '89, and I always had and have the philosophy that you need your first 7 or 8 players to be the same. You don't need a first group and a second group. I think after that 5-minute mark or so, you need people that can come in and change the game around. And we had 2 veterans. We had Herb plus Tad Duffermeyer that used to come in. Did a lot of the hard yakka. You get very, very little glory, and it's really a test of your character as to, am I doing this to help the team win, which obviously Herb did.
It actually suited me. I still was playing 35 minutes plus per game, and I was always a firm believer anyways, not necessarily who starts, it's who finishes the game when the game's on the line. And actually, that was the year that I actually broke my leg. We had a 3-on-1 fast break with Emery Atkinson in the middle. Steve Lenardin, who has a great break bone record. He took the charge as you should do when you're outnumbered, and they both fell on my leg and snapped the leg, and that was it. Done.
And I ran down to see how Herb was, and he said, my foot's fallen off. And he just had the main bone, it was just broken and sticking up like that. And it was just a tragic moment in Herb's career. And they finished up, they put a big steel plate in it. The steel plate would have probably been about that long, it was about that thick. So it wasn't a small little metal plate you're talking about. So you're talking about a plate about this big. And he came back and played with the metal plate in it, you know, nearly a year later, and he had a limp, which obviously he'd lost the flexibility that bone gives you. And he played really well. It was unbelievable that he played with almost a stiff leg for a whole season and was still able to contribute really well. And never once did he complain about pain or training or anything else. He was just the most amazing bloke that you could play with.
He was very much the heart and soul of the Cannons. He had been with the Cannons since 1979, one of the only players to play that length of time with the one team. And he was rewarded for that by being put on the staff, and it wasn't just a token reward. Herb did a terrific job because what he was able to do was maintain his association with the sponsors. He did a lot of work in sponsor liaison with the Cannons.
Herb's a subtle type of player. He just plays, he loves it, and he never was seeking accolades because he's always been a main player in most teams, but he does it so quietly and efficiently. And so for him to be inducted into the Hall of Fame was I think, important to him, but he didn't show it outwardly. But certainly I know, you know, inwardly and with his family and friends that it was a big achievement and certainly well-deserved.
Herb's induction into the Hall of Fame was pretty much a given, really. I think there's some players in the Hall of Fame that you can question their presence, but I think if you took Herb as the criteria for the Hall of Fame, not many other people would get in.
He was one of those guys who shows his loyalty. As a player, without question, one of the best. And if I was picking a team, he's on my list because he knows how to win.